Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. This is, I think, Irrational Labs event number 5. It is super exciting. Colin is here. That's Dr. Colin to all of you. He's going to talk about a field study he did about saving versus spending in household budgets. And hopefully,
oh, Ryan, no, you've got them mixed up. I'm doing my Windfalls one today.
Oh, doo-doo. Okay, well, watch this. That's doable. Look at how we can fix things. Wait for it. So what's the official title, Colin?
Windfalls of time and money.
Yeah, okay. So we got this, everybody. Colin's going to talk about windfalls of time and money, which is awesome too, and it gets an exclamation point. So take 2. So Colin's here. He's going to talk about windfalls of time and money. Look at that real-time fix. He is one of our IL behavioral scientists. Some of you met him in the cohorts, and he's the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management postdoc. So Colin is here to blow your minds, and hopefully we all get windfalls of time and money at the end of the, that's your gimmick, right, Colin? We're all gonna get cash.
Not gimmick, no.
Okay, well, maybe emojis, whatever you can do, we'll take it. So upcoming stuff next week, we have an article club. Lindsay's reading this. This is a fun one. It's sludge identification and solutions. Which is actually more fun than it sounds. So I will send out a pre-reading article on that. On May 18th, it's How I Became a Behavioral Scientist with our manager director, Evelyn Gosnell. Let's see, on May 27th, we have Save This, That's That. Right, Colin, I screwed up.
Yeah.
Saving versus spending in household budgets, but this will be exciting anyways. And then June 3rd, we'll be using BSI frameworks with Pauline Kaptis. And Friday, she's also going to do Asking Better Questions with behavioral science. So super exciting stuff. Additionally, I just found this out yesterday. We have a special Irrational Labs event. This is not a members only thing. This will be broadcast in the newsletter. But Seth Stevens David Owitz will be here talking. He's on his book tour. So he will be sharing with us, Don't Trust Your Gut. It's using data to get what you really want in life. He was a former Google AI scientist and did many other wild jobs in between. And he has a doctorate from somewhere as well. Colin, do you remember where his doc's from?
I don't know.
I think he's a Stanford Harvard guy, but I don't know which was which. But at any rate, his first book was Everybody Lies, which is quite funny. He's really good at kind of translating data science for the masses. So that's May 19th. That will be announced on the newsletter. So stay tuned for that. But Colin, if you didn't read his bio already, yes, we said he's at Toronto Rotman. Lots of important behavioral scientists up there. He conducts research in BSI with a focus on economic decision-making and psychological well-being in the workplace. His PhD is from the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and his bachelor's degree is in social studies from Harvard College. His research investigates, he was a squash player there. He was the captain of the squash team, but that's not actually part of this bio. But Colin, that's correct, right?
Many moons ago, yes.
Yes, so if anybody wants to challenge him to squash, which I infer is a real gentleman's sport because I've never heard of it, please DM him during the presentation to confuse him. But at any rate, his research investigates how our resources of time and money shape decision-making and well-being, from droughts to diseases to bonuses and vacations. Periods of scarcity and abundance provide a critical window into human judgment, decision-making, suffering, and flourishing, which we all want to focus on flourishing today. Prior to his doc, Colin worked as a consultant and researcher applying behavioral science in business and policy settings at BE Works, another Dan Ariely co-founded organization. That's in Toronto. And at the Bucera Center for Behavioral Economics, a US nonprofit based in Nairobi. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing just so that Colin can get ready. I will give you some quick house cleaning stuff on membership. So on membership, I just got the YouTube playlist this morning. So I have all the videos of membership events. I'm going to share that at the end of today's presentation. Ultimately, that's all going to be in our LMS. We've decided we're going to use disco.co. So if you're curious, go look at it. It's excellent. but the playlist is all going to be there. So we'll be adding to it, and ultimately those videos will go into the LMS. Our executive assistant didn't name each video yet. They're just dates. So I told her to go name them. So you might get the beta version, but everything's recorded. We're in soft launch until we're in the LMS. So please keep reaching out to me if you need assistance with stuff or missed a beat on a recording. This is the beauty of soft launch. But so speaking of beauty, Colin, take it away. Screen share.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so excited to chat with you all today. I'm going to talk to you about the psychology of and economics of windfalls. So what are windfalls? Windfalls are when we get some resource that we don't expect. And I'll specifically focus on windfalls of time and money here. We often like to focus on shortfalls. We focus on how to manage scarce resources, how to cope with the stresses of being too busy or not having as much money as we might want. And today, let's think about the opposite. How do we handle windfalls, moments when we have a temporary abundance? And I'm going to make the case that these windfall moments say a lot about us, and how we handle them is really critical for our psychological and economic well-being. I'm going to tell you about some research I did with a collaborator of mine, Ashley Willens from Harvard Business School. I'll spend about 40 minutes and then I'll open up for questions. But during that 40 minutes, please feel free to raise your hand or jump in and interrupt. You can raise your hand and Ryan will make sure that he interrupts me.
Yeah, I did warn Colin I forgot to get a drink, so I will leave the board for like a minute to get a drink, but otherwise I'll be here. And quick commercial, Miranda, yes, I will post the YouTube link in the Slack once they're properly labeled. But I will give you guys the beta YouTube link here in a hot minute. So interrupt, raise your hands, and Colin, continue.
So I'd like to begin with a short thought experiment. So first, I'd like you to imagine you came across an unexpected $1,000. How might you spend this money? How might it affect you? Think about that for a moment. And then think about, okay, you come across an unexpected 10 hours. How might you spend this time? What would you do with it if you got an extra 10 hours all of a sudden into your schedule? How would this affect your stress and well-being over the next week? These types of windfalls, we actually encounter all the time in the real world, windfalls of time and money. And a few examples, we get windfalls of money pretty regularly. Think of bonuses we get at the end of the year, commissions, or if you work on tips, people are getting unexpected windfalls, stock options, investment returns, and then gig economy workers too. They not sure how much money they're going to make, so they get lots of windfalls and shortfalls, and they need to manage that. And over the last 40 years, these windfalls have been becoming actually increasingly common as the labor market has shifted away from guaranteed salaries and more people work on incentive-based pay, things like bonuses, commissions, and stock options. More people are paid like this across all OECD countries and around the world. And how people manage these economic windfalls is really critical for their well-being. The same is true of windfalls of time. We come across these all the time in our lives. Think about shift workers, right? Shift workers, their schedules often are told to them only a day in advance, not sure exactly what their hours are going to look like. Sometimes they have more work, sometimes they have less, and all of a sudden they have a windfall at their disposal. Contract workers would also fall into this category, where they got really fluctuating hours, and sometimes they face shortfalls, sometimes they face windfalls. And certainly during COVID-19, a lot of people no longer had to commute to work. There's a windfall right there that we all experienced. And on that note, I'll show a little bit of what people did with that windfall of not having to commute into work. This is a little graph from The Economist here, showed that people actually worked more. They got a windfall of time, and on average, they worked a few extra minutes a day. They spent more time working, and then if you cut this data by parents versus non-parents, parents spent more time working and more time on childcare and household chores, and no extra time on leisure on average, whereas non-parents worked more and spent a little bit of this time on leisure. So there are some windfalls that we all face in our lives. And there's a big challenge here though. How do you study how windfalls shape people's economic and psychological well-being? In Irrational Labs, we like to run experiments, right? We don't just want to look at somebody who experienced a windfall and track them over time. That's just correlational. Could be subject to a whole lot of problems in the research design. But how do you run an experiment on windfalls? You can't exactly randomly assign people to get huge windfalls of time and money. So that was my challenge here. How do you do an experiment on windfalls of time and money? So to do that, I picked a really specific context. This is an aerial shot of Kibera, which is the largest informal settlement, or sometimes called a slum, in Africa. And it's home to about 300,000 people. And people in Kibera experience both really severe time poverty and financial poverty. Right? There's often an assumption that people who live in financial poverty have an abundance of time. Right? They're unemployed, they don't have much money, but they got a lot of idle time at their disposal. The truth is, financial poverty and time poverty often coincide, especially for working women in slums like this. So I ran a time use survey to investigate this. People living in this informal settlement here in Nairobi, that on average, working mothers in Kibera did about 45 hours of paid work per week, 40 hours of unpaid work, and earned a median weekly income of about $12. So they're both cash poor and time poor, this population that I was looking at specifically. So in this context here, I could provide meaningful windfalls of time and money. That would be really expensive to do if I did it in San Francisco. I would need millions and millions of dollars to be able to do that. But here, I could randomly give people either a big injection of cash or a pretty big injection of time. And I'll get to how I gave them time in a moment, because that's a critical thing here. But that's the main setup here. I went to a place that I looked at a population of people who are time poor and cash poor, and used money to either give them a big windfall of cash or a big windfall of time. And now I can randomly assign them in a way that's never been done before. I'm going to show you the results, but I wanted to just pause here for a moment to see at this step, are there any questions?
Colin, were you the most popular person in the city when you did this experiment?
I did this just before the pandemic, and we were a popular bunch. We gave people a pretty nice bump in their 40% increase for about 6 weeks. We gave them or 21 extra hours over the course of 6 weeks. So it was a good thing to be in my little experiment here. Dan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I've just been listening to somebody talk about natural experiments, which he talked about during the boot camp too. I bet you thought about some way of doing a natural ones. Did you play around with that idea? And obviously, I'm guessing it didn't quite work, but did you come close to a way of running it as a natural experiment?
I'm actually working on that right now separately on a follow-up, because that is the other way to think about this, right? So if you can't do an actual experiment like I'm going to present today, a natural experiment, what Dan means by that is you look at a group of people who just on happenstance look the same, but half of them got a windfall and half of them didn't, right? So one clear example might be you take, say, Tennessee versus Texas, and maybe Tennessee got a bigger stimulus check during COVID than Texas. I don't know if that's true, but that would be an example of it. It's not a perfect experiment because Tennessee and Texas aren't the same, but we'd say they're pretty similar. And then it just so happened that one of them got a windfall and one of them didn't. So you treat that as, you call it a natural experiment, or sometimes we call that a quasi-experiment. And that'd be a totally reasonable way to approach this as well. But they're hard to find something really clean like that. So this way is super clean, right? I really can use a little line of code to randomly assign people to get one or the other. And we know that the population is exactly the same. The only difference between these working mothers is whether they got time or money. So before I get into the experiment, I just want to take a little step back here to think about the idea of time poverty, because we don't really think of poverty in terms of time, we just think of it in terms of money. But a lot of people in developing countries living in financial poverty also face time poverty. And one problem is a lot of the aid organizations, charities, and government aid, they actually waste a lot of the recipients' time. So I'll give one small anecdote here. When I was working over in Kenya, there was a big US food aid project, spending millions and millions of dollars to provide low-income Kenyans with food. Yet these programs cost their recipients a huge amount of time. They had to walk long distances to collect the food, wait in line, fill out long forms, and then walk back. So they were getting food, but it was costing them time. And either purposefully or inadvertently, the US food aid program was not spending any money to try to save these people time. Now, there's an empirical question. Maybe they're right. Maybe they should just focus on giving them as much food as possible. But they could be wrong. They could be shooting themselves in the foot, essentially, by giving people one resource at the expense of another. An important one, I would say, is their time. So it's not just aid programs that waste people's time. We all get our time wasted by government. Think of standing in the line at the DMV, or here's just a little screenshot of a Medicaid application form for people who are low income, who can get Medicaid assistance. It's 31 pages long. And the Office of Internal and Regulatory Affairs calculated that the US government imposes over 11 billion hours of paperwork on US citizens every year. So governments don't spend a lot of money to try to save us time. In fact, they often cost us a lot of time. This is also true of companies. Even companies with a real strong economic incentive to use their employees' time wisely end up wasting a lot of it. There's a big survey across 29 occupations and found that 78% of employees reported frequently having idle time at work between tasks, right? Even a high-paid profession like doctors, for instance, reported spending about 17% of their total working time, or about 9 hours a week, on admin tasks, and it's a major contributor to doctor burnout. So even high status, high paid jobs like that end up having a lot of admin wasted time. So the big question is, should companies and governments and aid organizations be spending money to save their constituents, employees' time? Or is that worth the money, right? That's the big question here. So to investigate this, I first ran a pilot experiment here, a little pilot study at the Harvard Kennedy School with people who were Masters of Public Policy students. So the people whose ideas, like, we're gonna be the ones deciding how to dole out money, in the future. And I asked them, imagine you're consulting for a nonprofit in Kibera, in Nairobi, where I ran this study, and your job is to increase the well-being of working mothers here. And you've got $21 per recipient to spend, right? Which program would you as the policymaker choose? Do you want to give them just pure cash, a cash program? Do you want to give in-kind aid? So for instance, like food aid would be an example of in-kind aid. Or would you like to give them a time-saving program? So I'll just pause here for a second and think about what the Masters of Public Policy students said. Which programs did they favor here? All right, I'll reveal the results. Okay, 87% of the Harvard Kennedy School students said, give them cash. These people are living in poverty, we need to give them money. 13% chose in-kind aid, essentially food aid. Nobody chose time. So here is the next generation of policymakers, and they're saying time's not important for these folks, that we need to focus on correcting their financial deficits. It's actually totally reasonable, but this sets up the question is, are they right? Should we care about people's time more? So let's take us back to the field experiment we've got here. So I'll show you what I found when I actually ran this field experiment just before the pandemic. I'll show you how people spent the windfalls of time, how they spent the windfalls of money. I'll look at how the differential effects on people's well-being, economic well-being and psychological well-being. I'll show you who benefited most and who didn't benefit as much. And then I'll look a little bit of were there any drawbacks or what we might call negative externalities. Okay, so here was the design. I took employed mothers in Kibera, 1,550 of them, recruited from a sample of 22,000 Kibera residents. In order to be eligible, you had to work at least 20 hours per week and you had to have a school-aged child, right? So the reason I chose these people and not just anyone from Kibera was I wanted to look at people who are especially cash poor and time poor. So they're facing both, and then I randomly assigned them to get a windfall of one or the other, right? So now I randomly assign people to one of three conditions: a control condition, a financial windfall condition, or a time windfall condition. So let's just focus for now on the financial windfall. So quite a straightforward one. I gave people a windfall of about $15 per person. Remember that these people only made $12 a week. So this was a pretty substantial bump into their income. These are people living in pretty extreme poverty. And we know from past research that giving people money is good. You know, it's hardly groundbreaking, but a lot of people are really opposed to just giving handouts. They assume that they'll be spent horribly, that they won't have to do any good. The research on cash transfers shows that they do a lot of good. You know, they're not perfect tool for poverty, but they tend to increase well-being, reduce stress. People are more likely to have a job if you give them money, not less likely to have a job. If you're an entrepreneur, you tend to earn more money if we give you a cash transfer, not less. And it's really good for the empowerment of women and girls. They tend to stay in school more, can get out of abusive relationships. So giving cash is a good thing. So in my experiment, we expected cash to have a pretty positive effect. Okay, now here's the real kicker here. How do we give people time? What does the time windfall look like here? And to do this, I conducted a time use survey in Canberra because I wanted to be really careful about the way in which I gave these working mothers time. So I looked at how women in Canberra spend their time and how they spend their time on specifically on unpaid labor here. So this was the hours per week, the average hours per week that women in Canberra spent on these different chores. And a couple photos that I took when I was kind of walking through Canberra. And you can see kind of on the right there is a woman and her kid doing laundry. Extremely inefficient way of doing laundry. Nobody's a laundry machine over there, right? So they use these kind of buckets. They have to wait while their laundry is drying so that it doesn't get stolen. It's extremely time consuming. Cooking, also, they use these charcoal cook stoves that are really inefficient. So those are the two that I focused on. They're the ones that people spend a lot of time on. And I asked them questions of like, do you enjoy it? Do you socialize a lot? And in general, the answer for these two was no, right? Because if I'm going to buy them out of these chores, I don't want to be inadvertently taking away of something that they really enjoy doing or that's a key opportunity for socializing. So laundry and cooking, those are the ones I focused on. So what I gave people was either the financial windfall, cash, no strings attached, sent via mobile money. There, I could send them a text with a digital currency. Even the people living in poverty here have a mobile money system called M-Pesa. So I didn't have to give them cash. I could send them a text message with digital currency that they could access immediately. Okay? Or I gave them a voucher for either a laundry service or a prepared meal service, each of these for 3 consecutive weeks. And critically, these were matched on the cost to administer, right? So it cost me the exact same amount per person to either give you the time windfall or the financial windfall. So if you're a policymaker now, this is apples to apples. I've got $15 to spend per person here. Do I give it to them in time or do I give it to them in cash, which works better, right? That's the experimental design. I did it here from, this is an Google Maps shot of Kibera outlined in red on the south end of Nairobi. And Kibera Town Center is this really central building that I partnered with an NGO that built Kibera Town Center. It's called the Human Needs Project. And they were my NGO partner in order to launch this study. So it was a convenient place in the middle of Kibera for me to run my study. This is what it looks like. Here's a little shot from above it. You can see it's kind of right in the heart of the slum, pretty central spot. So I could provide these laundry services or prepared meal services from a central location. It didn't cost people time to come get them. So it's right in the heart of Kibera. Okay. This was a little schematic of the timeline, right? So people would do an eligibility survey, make sure I'm getting working mothers. They do a baseline survey asking about their psychological and economic well-being. Then in weeks 3 through 5, they get cash windfall or a time windfall, and then I follow up at the end. And so this is what you call a longitudinal field experiment. Okay, I'm going to stop teasing you, and I'm going to show you the results here. Okay, first thing. First big question. All right, I gave people a windfall of time. It saved them about 15 to 20 hours over the course of 3 weeks. What do they do with it? What do people who are very time poor do when you give them a nice injection of time? Well, what we find is they spend it mostly on labor, right? So if you look at this is kind of an interesting pattern, right? So when I first gave them if this is the graph on the left here, when I first gave them a windfall of time, their initial reaction was a little bit less work. Maybe they took a little more leisure, they rested a little bit more, but then they started doing more labor. By the end of the experiment, they were taking this time and doing more work, right? And unpaid labor, they did a lot more unpaid labor. Maybe they were putting off some chores that they really needed to do. And suddenly I gave them a windfall of time and they got some unpaid labor done that they've been putting off, right? So, but overall, if you look at the mean effect here, the average effect is people did more work, not less, when you give them an injection of free time. And notice this pattern looks kind of similar to the one I showed you from The Economist for modern workers in developed countries during COVID, right? We took away commutes and suddenly people worked more, not less. So this kind of cuts against some common, lay theories saying, oh, if you give people more time, they're just going to spend it, on leisure activities, watching TV. Turns out that's typically not what people do when you give them an unexpected windfall of time. And leisure overall went down, right? So active leisure, things like exercise and socializing, passive leisure, things like watching TV, reading and resting, right? Pretty flat, right? So the main trend was like people did a little bit less leisure and more work compared to before the windfall, right? Okay, next big question. How did they spend the cash? If you got randomly assigned and you received a cash windfall, did you blow it on alcohol and tobacco and gambling? The answer seems to be no. These working mothers spent it pretty productively. Food and groceries was the biggest thing that they reported spending money on. Number two here was business inputs. A lot of people, they're running a fruit stand or selling clothing. They injected it directly into the inventory of their business. A lot of people paid down their kids' school fees with this. That was 19% of people said they used it on school fees. Household goods, right? Some people put it into saving. Some people gave it to their church as a tithe, paid medical expenses, right? But as you look, this list ordered in terms of what were the most common things that people spent the money on. Alcohol, gambling, tobacco shows up nowhere on this list. So that's another common critique of cash transfers is people blow it. Looks like especially working mothers do not blow this money. Ryan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I did. Edgar has a question. Edgar, you want to ask?
Yeah, so just basically in the time one, did people know that it was just going to be run for 3 weeks or 5 weeks, whatever, or did they not know when it was going to finish?
So yeah, great question, Edgar. So a windfall is by definition unexpected. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it a windfall, right? So people showed up to the experiment not knowing that they would get anything, right? They just show up to do my baseline survey. And then they're randomly assigned after that to either get the cash or the time. But we tell them then, okay, you've been assigned to get a cash windfall once per week for the next 3 weeks. So they know. Time, okay. Same thing. No. Yeah.
So my question is if the behavior would be different if they knew it was going to be a permanent windfall, like not a windfall, but now it's your lifestyle has changed by X percentage points, right?
Yeah. So if you gave people, if it wasn't a windfall, if we weren't studying windfalls here, we were studying, a fundamental change to their working life, right? Or suddenly, they didn't have to go collect water, right? You can give people time by maybe improving infrastructure, right? You get better water systems. How would people use that very differently? It's a great question, right? I mean, I think initially it would feel like a windfall, but then people might habituate, right? And start reverting back to old habits. But that's an awesome question. Would people start using it more and more productively or less and less? My hunch is actually that what people's common wisdom is that, oh, if I just inject a temporary abundance of time, people might think, oh, this is my one chance. I'm gonna just spend this doing what I want to do, right? So I actually think it's more likely that if you gave people a extended one or a permanent one, that they'd actually spend it more and more productively because now they can rely on it. They know it's not going away. I think there's this tendency of like, if it's going away, I got to capitalize it now. This is my only chance.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
That's my reaction, but that's what research should look at. right? Of you should look at these differences. In this study, I'm specifically focused on windfalls, but yeah, we should totally look at that stuff too. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, I was going to say, Moira kind of brings up the universal basic income research, which is kind of similar in terms of a type of experiments, because that's not a windfall, right? That would be a long-term subsidy. But Brett, could you ask your question, please?
Sure, it's kind of related to Dan's question. What I was thinking about is not a, in effect, minimal income or up leveling in income, but what would happen if the time windfall was extended? Because what I was imagining is a backlog of tasks and activities that I think what I heard you say, Colin, is that folks use their time windfall to take care of these things that had been lingering. At least I think that's what you inferred. And so I thought, well, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. But what happens when the backlog of activities goes to near zero? Maybe I start to spend less time in unpaid work or what have you, and more time in leisure.
Yeah. So it could be that people spend, it's because they've got this backlog, right? And once they've gone through that, yeah. Now, the other thing that people might have put off is things that can't be covered in a week or two, right? So think of I want to change jobs, right? I need to do some job training. That requires reliable extra time over the course of months, right? Not 3 weeks. So you could imagine that people, once they finish their backlog of tasks, then they start spending a lot on leisure. Or you could imagine that once I've got a reliable amount of extra time, I actually now take on bigger tasks. I've been wanting to change jobs for years, and now I can finally do it. So I'm actually chatting with some bigger food aid organizations to try to run a version of this that is 2 years long rather than 3 weeks long. Because I think that's a really important question, right? I gave people 20 hours over the course of 3 weeks. Yeah, that's nice to have that, but it's not going to fundamentally change your life, right? That's why this study is called Windfalls of Time and Money, right? And not permanent extra time, right? So I would love to know what happens. And then the big question there is, if you're doing a UBI, should you also think about, well, maybe I should try to give people a little bit of spare time. Maybe they can't use the cash that wisely if they're so time strapped. And this is what I've been chatting with a lot of aid organizations about over the last couple of years since this study was run, was saying, yeah, you're giving people food, you're giving people money, but sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. Well, one of the reasons it might not be as effective is, yeah, you gave me a little injection of money, but I can buy some things I needed. I can pay down some debts. I can pay my medical fees off, but I can't fundamentally change my life if I'm so busy with unpaid labor and paid labor. I can't move. I can't switch jobs. I can't, finish a, high school education, right? So I think you're on the right track there, Brett.
Yeah, there are a lot of additional questions, but I think we should hold them. I think you should kind of continue so that we kind of get through the whole arc of your story here.
Yeah, okay. So continuing the story, another kind of critical question was psychological well-being, right? So freed up people's money or resources of time, which one had a bigger effect on people's well-being? And one way I measured that was with something called the perceived stress scale. So this is a measure of how much stress people are feeling in the moment. And it's used by a lot of researchers who study the economic effects of stress and psychological effects of stress. And we know from past research that when you're more stressed, it harms your cognitive functioning. You do worse on IQ style tests. That makes you more short-sighted. You're less likely to delay gratification to get a bigger payoff later. It undermines people's productivity and work performance. And it can lead to poverty traps, basically meaning that if I'm really stressed, just as I was mentioning to Brett there, if I'm really stressed, I might not be able to use the money as wisely as I might otherwise, right? So stress can really harm people and make it more difficult to lift them out of poverty. So how do we do here? Which did my experiment actually reduce stress very well? And so here's the pattern for cash, right? So we've got their baseline level of perceived stress. And then you can see in week 3, when people started getting the cash transfers, their stress went down, pretty significantly, right? And then it continues to go down in week 4 and week 5. But then, kind of fascinating pattern, it comes back up at the end when I've taken it away, right? So they got 3 cash transfers, pretty significant, 40% bump in their income for 3 weeks, and all of a sudden it's gone now, and the stress goes back up, but not all the way to baseline, right? So this D of 0.29 is a measure of effect size, showing that that's baseline versus end line. So it's not like the effect entirely dissipates after you take it away. People are still less stressed. So that's kind of a nice finding. Interesting that there's a pretty big rebound effect, but not all the way, right? So, okay, let's compare that against time. And this was kind of an interesting finding here. It tracks pretty closely, right? So it's got a very similar effect at end line, and we see the same kind of rebound pattern, right? So in week 3, when you give people more time, they report feeling less stressed. It's a little bit flatter throughout the experiment than the cash transfers were, and then it rebounds, but not all the way, right? So one takeaway from this is like, okay, we give people resources, whether it's time or money, and both of them work, right? The others is, well, it's kind of surprising that time did so well, given that these people are really poor, financially poor, right? And we just remember the little pilot I ran with the Harvard Kennedy School students. They said, don't give anybody time, right? And here we see time doing essentially just as well as cash in terms of reducing people's stress. Okay, so let's think about why this might be happening here, right? So this is what we do in an experiment. We launch the experiment, we look at the main effects on something like perceived stress, and then you start breaking it down. Why, what's explaining these results? Why was it that people felt less stressed? Right, so a couple possible ideas here. So when I give people cash, well, maybe people are less stressed because they can spend more. They can buy the things they've been wanting to buy. Maybe they can buy hedonic things, and by hedonic, I just mean like, things that you really want, not things that you need, right? You might want to buy some leisure activities or some entertainment, or eat out, things like that, right? Maybe you can contribute to your savings, and that really makes you feel better, or reduce your debts. Or maybe it's about having cash on hand, right? Just having some liquid resources at your disposal might make you feel less exposed to a shock that you might get. So maybe it's just having that little extra cash on hand. And then for time, what might explain the results? Well, maybe I can spend more time making money, right? I want to spend more time on my job, and I just haven't been able to before. So that's helpful. Maybe I get to do some leisure activities. Maybe I get to spend more time socializing, or spend less time on unpaid labor. So when I break down the results and I try to look at mechanism, these are the 2 that stand out. So I look at all these, and you model them and look at which one, and you call this pathway analysis, and I'll show you more detail in just a second here. But which one of these best explains the reduction in stress? And the 2 that best explain it for cash and time respectively is cash. The decrease in stress is best explained by having more cash on hand, right? And for time, the benefits are best explained by reducing unpaid labor, right? So this is how you do kind of a pathway analysis. This looks really complicated. It's really not. It's really just kind of a regression model where you control for all those other things, and you look at the pattern of associations here, right? So you can see on the top side of this that UCT, unconditional cash transfer, that's what I mean. You give people cash, they have more cash on hand, and that is really closely linked to the reduction in perceived stress. So if controlling for all those other things, you see this path of it being through cash on hand. When people report, when I talk to these people and interview them, they say, yeah, it felt really nice to just have a little bit more cash in my digital checking account, because I wasn't worried if something broke in my house, or I needed to buy something small. I now had that little chunk of change ready to go if I needed it. And then for time, it's separate pathway, right? So it looked like people they really don't like doing that much unpaid labor, not surprisingly, right? And when we reduced that, that seemed to be the factor that was reducing their perceived stress. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about things. It's here, there's multiple pathways through which we can reduce people's stress. And we shouldn't be narrow-minded in thinking about, oh, people are financially poor. The only way to reduce their stress is by giving them money. giving them time seems to have a separate but equal effect on something like perceived stress. Okay, now one of the most interesting findings is the last one I'm going to present to you today. And here I want to look at specifically micro entrepreneurs, right? So micro entrepreneur, my definition is people who their primary source of income is from a business that they own. So for in an informal settlement like Kibera, that could be, these are working mothers, remember. They might, be house cleaners. They might sell fruit, have a fruit stand. They might own their own little restaurant in the slums, right? They might sell clothing, right? So this is their own business, and they make money from the profits, right? So in my sample of 1,550 people, there were about 500 micro entrepreneurs. So it's a lot of people, right? So a lot of people who are living in poverty are actually entrepreneurs. And when I gave entrepreneurs either cash or time, I looked at, okay, who earns more at the end of this study, right? So if I give you cash, you could buy inventory, you could buy some employees to help you, you could just spend more time on it. And what I find is that people in the cash condition, they do earn a little bit more money than they were before, but they're out-earned by the people who got time. So by the end of this study, this is showing the average earnings per week of people who got time transfers or cash transfers. If I give you time transfers to micro entrepreneurs, what do they do with them? They basically injected all of it into their business, and then they out-earned the cash transfer people. So this suggests that it's a little bit more lasting, right? Now, these people have actually grown their business in some small way over the course of this 6-week period. So kind of really interesting finding. You could imagine now thinking, okay, for micro entrepreneurs, we really need to think about their resources of time. And there's also an element here that's interesting. Past research has looked at maybe female entrepreneurs are less able to use cash because they have such high burdens of unpaid labor, particularly in a place like Kenya, where there's still kind of norms around women doing a lot more of the unpaid labor than men. So the idea is here, well, maybe female entrepreneurs in Kenya can't use the cash as productively as you might hope, but they can use the time, right? You give them time and they inject it into their business and they make more money. Okay, so a few just takeaways, and then I'll open up to more questions. We're constantly confronted with these kinds of windfalls of time and money. Windfalls are a part of our life, and how we manage them is a really fundamental challenge for ourselves as individuals, as well as for organizations. Right? Organizations need to pay attention to these windfalls and study how it affects their customers and their employees. If you're running a business, you have to think about the windfalls that your customer might get. You might want a slice of that. If you're a fintech company and people get, their year-end bonus, maybe I should really focus on that moment, right? That's a key moment when even people who are poor have some disposable resources, right? We tend to think of people who are living in poverty of just being a chronic state of poverty, but really it's a roller coaster. They experience shortfalls and windfalls, and what they do in those windfall moments are really critical for helping to buffer against some shortfalls that are coming down the road. So when I work with companies, I often tell them to think about how do you take advantage of these windfall moments to make sure that they're actually helpful in protecting against future shortfalls, and don't treat poverty and financial deprivation as a static state. And my final advice would be for everyone on this call is try to use your windfalls wisely. Think about when you're affected, when you get a windfall of time or money, try to pay attention and notice that you just got a windfall and try to use it wisely. So I'll pause there and I'll open up to questions for the last few minutes here.
So for questioning, there have been actually quite a lot of stuff coming through fast and furious, but what I'm going to ask you to do is just use the hand raise emoji, please, in Zoom, which should be in the upper right-hand corner. Oh, you want to talk about your collaborators while hands
I
are
figured,
raised?
well, I'll leave it here while we do questions, because these are the people I worked with. So Ashley Willens, she was the co-author on this work. She's a professor at Harvard Business School, studies time and money trade-offs. And then the Human Needs Project. They are the NGO based in Kibera. that helped me launch this, and a fantastic organization that's doing a lot of great work there. So I wanted to give a little shout out here. These are the two people that helped me pull this off.
Excellent. Cool. So first question is from Brett out west. Go ahead, Brett.
Hey everybody. So I was thinking about this time windfall, and how interesting it might be to compare largely the cultural impact and the impact on people with less poverty. And my question is coming from the experience I've had with companies where on consulting work that I've led, targeting innovation behaviors. So that's the desired outcome. And one of the things that a lot of companies will do, or a lot of times will provide advice around, is creating time. So a company may make a commitment to their employees that says, every Friday from 9 o'clock on, you can use your time to either innovate on something that you enjoy, or you can just go take care of life stuff so that you have more time and hopefully more creativity. So I was thinking it's kind of the same thing, but obviously very different populations. Do you have any inclination or maybe there's already been research similar?
I think the nice thing that you mentioned there was you didn't tell the employees how to spend that time, right? And I think that's critical. There has been stuff, you'll recall Google used to have their famous 20% time, where they would say, 20% of your time, you should be working on whatever you want. We hire smart people, we should give them the freedom, and some of their good products came from that. But it wasn't totally open-ended, right? It wasn't go home and do some chores, right? It was work on some kind of work project. One thing that is from this work, I didn't say a word about how people spend this time. And I told them, this is no strings attached. You get this money no matter what you do with it. Same with the time. Do whatever you want with it. And I think that is kind of a critical thing that people are reluctant to do. They think we have to put some conditions on this. They think we have to be a little more paternalistic. And I think sometimes it's actually really good for well-being and sometimes for productivity to say, this is yours. This windfall is completely yours. So there hasn't been research with companies doing completely agnostic there. There is a ton of research looking at what they call conditional versus unconditional cash transfers. And that is a very robust, but conditional versus unconditional time transfers, nobody's really looked at that. So I think that's a real fascinating area. And I would say, just based on how people spent the windfalls in this research, that I think you probably don't want to put too many restrictions around it because that can undermine the benefits.
Awesome question. So now to Brian, who is the artist formerly named as Brain.
Thank you. You kind of just answered my question, but I was thinking about like the stimulus money that just happened over the last 2 years and bonuses and things like that. And would we have helped people more if we expose them to some thoughts like this? Like if you want to reduce your stress, do this, or if you want to increase your peace of mind, do that. But yeah, I guess you kind of just talked through that. Like, should we actually give people, I guess, what's the balance there, of conditions we should give them versus just let them, just assume they'll do the right thing, which it seems like the data shows they do good things with the money.
Yeah, this is on average, right? Of course, there were people in my sample who didn't, right? It's not like everybody's doing it great, but on average, people spend it more productively than you'd think. But my first advice here would be, rather than forcing people or telling them what to do, give them tools, right? So say somebody comes along a financial windfall, fintech companies could give them budgeting tools, trade-off tools to help them think about how to allocate the windfall. So rather than doing something like a conditional cash transfer, or you think of the alternative to cash transfers is often things like food stamps. So they're saying, oh, we're going to give you money, but you got to spend it on food. We're going to restrict. So that's very paternalistic and heavy-handed. The alternative would be, well, no strings attached. a middle ground that I quite like, and I've been doing some follow-up research on this, is yeah, you can do whatever you like, but here are some tools to help you make the best decision for yourself, right? So we sometimes call these decision aids. And I think that's a nice way of giving people the freedom to do what they want, but also first helping them notice, hey, you just got a windfall. This is a really critical moment. Use it wisely. And here are some tools to help you make that decision. So my thoughts would be tools, not restrictions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to go to Sharon, and then we'll go. Dan has a question in the chat, so we'll go to Dan after that. Oh, Prashad's there too, and Dave. Oh, we got lots of hands. Go, Sharon, go.
Okay, great. This is fantastic, really fascinating research. I had a question though, as you like zoom out from this, are you walking away feeling that the value of this was more an emotional benefit of less stress because I have cash in hand? Or was it more a functional benefit of reduced poverty? Because they ended up spending the money, and the people that got the extra time actually made money, but as micro entrepreneurs, that's not necessarily repeatable after the time windfall goes away.
Yeah, I think that's nice, right? So that's a good point. So what is this like? I'm just feeling better. One thing I would say is stress is a predictor of downstream like productivity and work performance. So I would say if I can reduce your stress, that's going to have economic consequences down the road. Right now, I ran this study for 6 weeks, right? They do baseline surveys, they get the windfalls for 3 weeks, I follow up, right? I didn't run this for 2 years, so I can't see, did they get a promotion at their job, right? Are they, is their kid still in school 6 months later? Are they making more money 6 months later, 2 years later? You'd want to look at much larger scale things would be helpful. But I thought of stress as what you might call a leading indicator, which is, yeah, I care about people's emotional well-being. But one of the reasons I chose stress as my marker of well-being is because it's linked to so many important economic consequences down the road. So my prediction would be, if I made you less stressed, you'll be making more money and have some practical benefits, in the weeks and months following.
Great point. I've read some research on that, the work that was done in San Francisco on poverty and stress. And so, yeah, great point. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but I think that's great. And I looked at some, like this entrepreneurs one. This is a very practical finding, but as well as emotional findings. I actually now try to encourage economists that I work with to say, hey, you should not just measure practical things, especially if you have a shorter intervention. You should measure leading indicators, and stress is an important one.
Oh, that's very cool, Colin. Dave, you're up next, and then that just surprised me when your screen shrunk.
We didn't share anymore. We can look at each other rather than my screen.
Very cool, Dave, and then Prashant. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious. So one of the graphs you showed talked about leisure, and so there's a piece of me, this might be related to what Sharon was asking. There's a piece of me that wonders, was the reduction in stress just due to receiving something that made people something of value and made people feel important, cared for? Because a lot of stress comes from feel isolation and sort of desperation. And I'm wondering if there's an experiment to do that might be like, could you gift leisure somehow? And I don't know, community concerts or family gather. I'm not sure what it would be. Football games, and what would be how would that impact the leading indicator that you're talking about of stress? Like,
yeah. I think that's a great idea, and something that most charities would not think to do, right? Right, because they would say, "Oh, that's you're giving people in poverty leisure. Like, let's give them food or money." But I think that's like something that people should think more carefully about. So, for instance, in informal settlements in Kenya, their church is a huge part of their life. Could you contribute to their church event? Allow people to socialize more. That might be actually really important for their well-being, and then have economic downstream positive consequences. My big takeaway there, though, would be I want to see more people do experiments where the cost, where they're matched on cost to administer. So just to highlight what I mean by that is, if I'm a charity and I got $1 million to spend, I don't want to just dole it out to one thing and see what happens. I want to randomly assign people to either get, say, like my placebo group, which might be the cash equivalent, or spend that exact same amount of money and give leisure time, right? And then, because the goal here is to say, what's the biggest bang for our buck? And we're trying to be really empirically rigorous and say, okay, per dollar spent, did leisure time, giving people more leisure time, outperform the cash equivalent? And this is a high bar that charities need to take more seriously. Sometimes they've got a great idea that they love. It sounds really great, but if it can't beat the cash equivalent, cash is so cheap to give away, very little overhead. I don't need to hire a ton of people to just give away money. If your charitable program doesn't beat the cash equivalent, you should be very wary about doing it and should think about just giving away money.
Yeah, that's
Thank you.
powerful. That's powerful. Thanks, Dave. Good to see you again also. So hi. And then Prashant, did I say your name correctly?
Yes. Hi. So thanks, Colin, for the talk. It was super interesting. So I had a question around how do you give back that free time, right? Would it be helpful if we structure saying these are some of the ideas in which you can use your free time, or based on people who have had free time in the past, neighbors around you, like would that have changed how people made use of that extra time? And I asked this because I design productivity tools at my company. So we constantly talk about giving back time, but we haven't quite measured like what people do with that extra time.
That fits with the previous question. We were talking about tools, Brian's question about tools and rather than rules, right? I think if you're thinking of, okay, I'm not going to tell you what to do this time, but I'm going to help you notice it, see the value in it, and then maybe offer you these productivity tools to help you think about what to do with it. And I would say the balance there is just trying to not be too paternalistic, right? So I wouldn't want to say, you should really do X with your time. I would want to use a productivity tool that helps me make a decision that I'm happy with down the road, right? So in behavioral science, we sometimes call these intention action gaps, right? How do I design productivity tools to help me follow through on my own intentions rather than telling me what to do, right? So I think I would love to run like follow experiments where I gave people time and I gave them some productivity tools. I think that'd be a super cool thing to do. Thanks, Prashant. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was just waiting for cash prizes. Sorry, productivity tools. I was waiting for electronic transfers, Colin. None of them have come.
Well, I'll finish with it. I did ask people which, there's a separate group of people, which condition would you like to be in if you could be in this experiment? Would you rather get the time or the cash? And as you might expect, almost 100% of people said they wanted the cash. So if you ask people, they say cash, but they actually benefit a lot from the time, right? So I think there's an interesting takeaway too, that sometimes we don't appreciate our own time as much as we ought to. So again, I'll finish with, use your windfall.
Well, I love the element of would you rather to this. Now they have these would you rather books, like would you rather wear a fanny pack for the rest of your life or, have to scratch your head every fourth Tuesday. And this is kind of awesome because you definitely make these would you rather questions quite real, although I love fanny packs. So to everybody, can we please give Colin a virtual round of applause? It was spectacular, super interesting. I think one of the interesting things we're learning is the membership thing is happening is some presentations are more 101, right? They're like kind of the basics. And then some stuff is like, hey, graduate level, which is Colin's, right? This is like, hey, this is how I crushed something in the field. And these are some cool insights I had. And I think once we go over to LMS, I'm going to kind of try and tag things as like, I don't know, I'm going to have a cool names. It's not going to be like beginner, intermediate, and superstar, but something like this. So if you have any ideas on those titles, Slack me. Colin's coming back to do your other presentation on, Colin.
I'm going to be looking at like budgeting tools. So how like the design of budgeting tools shapes how you spend your money.
Awesome. And Colin, I can tell you're already gonna be a fan favorite. So if you have 15 other presentations you want to queue up down the road, just let me know. We'll get you on the calendar. Everyone will be here, the whole gang. We hit about 50 today. So that's awesome. We have about 250 members to start. So I did the math myself. That's about 20%. You're welcome. I'm a math genius. And on that note, reach out to me if you have any follow-ups with Colin, and I'd be happy to pass those questions along. But go forth and have a spectacular day. I did post the, what did I do? I did post the YouTube link again. It still needs another scrub on the titles, but for you, you can check it in its raw form with dates only. And, we'll catch you all on Slack, but thank you everybody so much. Appreciate all your time and energy. I was